Damien Cross was not a man the
He
world
is your son,
negotiated with.
Damien.
He was a man the world adjusted itself around. His name did not circulate in public conversations. It echoed in sealed intelligence files, encrypted warnings, and quiet emergency meetings where powerful men lowered their voices before speaking about him. Across continents, underground networks treated his decisions like natural law, unavoidable, irreversible, absolute. He had built an empire where emotion was treated as a liability and hesitation as a form of weakness. Every branch of his structure, financial, operational, and strategic, was designed around one principle. Control must never be shared, and fear must always remain directional. His world functioned like a machine that never allowed unpredictability to survive for long. Inside that machine, Damien Cross had become something close to untouchable. There were no visible cracks in his life, no public scandals, no emotional attachments that could be exploited. Even his closest allies understood a simple truth about him. He did not lose situations. He eliminated outcomes before they had the chance to form. Governments tracked him, criminal organizations feared him, and rival empires avoided direct confrontation because survival rates were statistically unacceptable. Yet on a night that began like every other night under his control, something shifted without warning. It did not begin with violence. It began with interruption. A critical operation briefing was cut short when an unverified breach alert surfaced across one of the secured internal channels. At first, it appeared routine, another attempt by smaller factions testing boundaries. But within minutes, Damien's analysts noticed something unusual in the pattern. The disruption was not random. It was focused, directed, almost personal in structure. That realization alone introduced the first fracture in control. Damien left the command room without raising his voice or altering his expression. But those who observed him closely understood something rare had occurred. He was reacting instead of dictating. In his world, that distinction mattered more than violence itself. As he moved through secure corridors, reports continued to escalate. Financial channels were stable. Territories were intact. No external war had begun. And yet, his attention was no longer on empire maintenance. It had shifted toward a single anomaly that did not fit any established threat model. The emotional crack was subtle at first, an unfamiliar weight pressing into his awareness. Not fear, not confusion. Something more destabilizing. Uncertainty that had no tactical explanation. Damien Cross had built his entire existence on eliminating unknowns before they matured into risk. Yet this unknown had already reached him without permission. In the background, his organization began to sense instability. Subordinates noticed delays in his response patterns. Strategic decisions were being paused longer than usual. Rumors moved quietly through internal channels. Something had disrupted the Dawn's equilibrium. And in that disruption, the structure of his control began to shift in ways no one could yet quantify. Damien stopped inside a dim corridor, the silence around him heavier than usual. For the first time in years, he did not immediately see a solution forming ahead of him. Instead, he felt the uncomfortable presence of something unaccounted for enter his life without authorization. Not an enemy he had identified, not a threat he had prepared for, something else entirely. A sealed message arrived on his encrypted device without origin signature. No tactical classification, no priority code, just a direct transmission bypassing every layer of his security architecture. Damien's eyes narrowed as he opened it. The screen displayed only 2 words. No context, no explanation, no warning. You're a father. One sentence was enough to collapse a lifetime of emotional walls. Damien Cross did not react immediately. He did what he'd always done when reality attempted to bypass logic. He rejected it. The message on his screen did not feel like information. It felt like interference. A distortion that did not belong in the structure of his world. For a man who had built entire systems around controlling outcomes, uncertainty was not something to accept. It was something to eliminate. For several seconds, he stared at the words without moving. You're a father. The phrase should have been meaningless. It had no verified source, no attached identity, no operational context. Yet it remained on his screen like an unauthorized intrusion into something far more protected than his systems. His sense of order. His first response was denial. Not spoken, not expressed, executed. He triggered an internal verification sweep across every major intelligence channel under his control. If this claim had any connection to reality, it would surface as a trace: financial records, surveillance anomalies, medical data intersections, or old operational overlaps. Damian Cross did not believe in coincidence. He believed in patterns that had not yet been fully mapped. While the systems processed, something unfamiliar began to surface beneath his discipline: memory, not strategic memory. Emotional fragments he had long kept buried beneath operational priority. Faces of people who had once come close enough to matter, and then proved why distance was safer than attachment. Moments of trust that had been converted into leverage by others. Silence that followed betrayal not as peace, but as structure rebuilt after collapse. For a brief moment, those fragments threatened to align into something dangerous. He shut them down instinctively, but not before they left residue. When the intelligence confirmation arrived, it did not arrive gently. It arrived as classified verification, cross-reference biometric overlap, historical location match. A single unresolved identity chain tied to a woman whose existence had been erased from most public and private records years ago. Damian Cross read the report once, then again, and for the first time in his life, he did not immediately discard the information. The unknown woman tied to the file had no active surveillance footprint, no current financial activity, no confirmed location, but she existed within his past in a way that suggested deliberate concealment, not accidental disappearance. Something had been hidden, something that had survived his attention. Inside the Empire, subtle changes began to register. Operational delays increased by seconds that should not have mattered, but did. A financial approval sat pending longer than standard protocol allowed. Strategic briefings were interrupted once, then twice, as Damian's focus drifted in ways his advisors had never witnessed. They noticed it before they understood it. Their leader was no longer purely processing threats. He was processing uncertainty. Whispers began moving through his inner circle. Not rebellion, not panic. Something more fragile. Concern. Because a man like Damian Cross was not allowed to hesitate. Hesitation created space, and space created collapse. For the first time, the system built around and began adjusting to him instead of the other way around. In a secured advisory meeting, one of his closest strategists carefully observed his silence and made a decision no one had ever dared to make before. "Sir, your focus is shifting." No response came immediately. That absence of response became its own answer. Damian Cross was not unaware of the change. He was analyzing it, measuring it, containing it. But beneath every calculation, something unfamiliar remained unclassified, a disturbance that did not behave like an enemy, and could not be ignored like one. Later that night, a full intelligence reroute confirmed what he already suspected, but had refused to accept without verification. The woman connected to the message had existed, had disappeared, and had done so deliberately. But before vanishing completely, she left behind a single coordinate marker, an active location ping that had not been there before. A place Damian Cross could not ignore, because it was not just a location. It was a first thread leading back to something he had buried long before he became the most feared man alive. The heir of the most feared man alive had been living like a ghost in silence. The location Damian Cross had ordered to be investigated did not appear significant at first glance. It was not a fortress, not a hidden bunker, not a high-security compound guarded by private armies. It was something far more unsettling, ordinary, a quiet residential district removed from the known influence zones of his empire, the kind of place where surveillance cameras existed, but attention did not, where people lived without realizing how easily they could disappear from higher systems of power. Inside the hidden layer of anonymity, intelligence operatives confirmed something that did not fit any previous calculation of Damian Cross's life. A child existed there. Ethan Cross. The name itself should have carried weight. It should have been registered in his internal records. But it was absent from every structured file Damian had ever authorized. That absence was not accidental. It was engineered. The child was very young, still in the fragile stage of life where awareness had not yet fully formed into understanding. Yet, even without comprehension, his existence had already reshaped the entire architecture of Damien Cross's reality. And with him, a woman, not present in official systems, not active in known networks, but confirmed through cross-reference intelligence as the mother, living under restricted protection conditions that suggested deliberate concealment rather than exile. A powerful emotional contradiction formed immediately within the structure of Damien's mind. The most feared man alive had a part of his life that had never been under his control. That contradiction did not weaken him. It unsettled something deeper. Reports confirmed the reason for concealment was not random. It was strategic. The child had been hidden because Damien Cross's enemies did not operate on simple retaliation anymore. They operated on inheritance logic, targeting what came after power, not power itself. Legacy had become vulnerability. Inside Damien's operational center, the verification process completed without error. Biometric alignment, historical cross-linking, and encrypted record recovery confirmed the impossible truth. The child was real and biologically connected to him. For a man who had eliminated emotional dependency from every layer of his existence, this confirmation did not create sentiment. It created disruption. He did not speak for several minutes after receiving the final report. The silence around him was not emptiness. It was recalibration. Systems that had always responded instantly to threats now paused, as if even his internal logic required time to process what had been introduced. A legacy he never prepared for now existed outside his control, not as an asset, not as a strategy, but as a responsibility. Something unfamiliar began forming beneath the surface of his calculated world. Not protection driven by power, but protection driven by presence. The idea that something existed which could not be replaced, duplicated, or negotiated away. Damien Cross issued a command without raising his voice. A full covert verification unit was deployed. No exposure, no contact, no disturbance of the subject, only observation, only confirmation. But even as the order was executed, something inside his structure had already changed. The system that once prioritized dominance now began accounting for vulnerability it had never been designed to protect. Hours passed. Then the second report arrived. It did not contain analysis. It contained alert classification. Security teams monitoring the child's location detected movement patterns that did not belong to local authorities or known protection units. Unknown armed observers had taken position, and they were not arriving. They were already there. He built an empire on fear, but had no system for fatherhood. Damien Cross stood in silence long after the report stabilized, as if motion itself had become optional. Around him, his world continued functioning with mechanical precision. Updates arriving, units repositioning, surveillance tightening around the child's location. But inside his mind, something unfamiliar refused to settle into a category. Responsibility without strategy. That was the problem. Everything in Damien Cross's existence had always been solvable through structure. Threats had patterns. Enemies had motivations. Even chaos, over time, revealed logic if studied long enough. But what had entered his life now did not behave like any of those things. It did not demand elimination. It demanded protection. And protection, in his world, had never existed without purpose attached to control. A fragment of memory surfaced uninvited. Buried years ago beneath layers of calculated isolation, there had been a time when closeness had existed as a possibility, not a risk. But every time he had allowed proximity, it had been converted into leverage, weakness, or destruction. Each outcome had reinforced the same conclusion. Distance was not emotional preference. It was survival architecture. That was how Damien Cross had learned to avoid anything resembling attachment. Now that avoidance had failed, because the child did not exist in theory. He existed in reality. And reality, unlike strategy, did not wait for permission. Across secured channels, intelligence confirmed increasing instability around the child's perimeter. The unknown armed observers were not static. They were adjusting positions, tightening containment angles, testing response timing, not random aggression. Structure reconnaissance before execution. The implication was simple. Someone was preparing to act. Damien's expression did not change, but something inside his control framework shifted. For the first time, He was not evaluating risk to his empire. He was evaluating proximity to something he could not afford to lose without ever having admitted it mattered. He issued a directive for extraction readiness, not evacuation, not containment. Extraction. His inner circle noticed immediately the adjustment in tone, in timing, in priority hierarchy. Orders that would normally pass through multiple authorization layers were now bypassing structure entirely. Even his most trusted operatives recognized what they had never seen before. Damian Cross was moving personally. That realization spread faster than any threat update. Within the underground network, movement of Damian Cross was not just operational. It was seismic. Rival groups detected it within minutes. Surveillance nodes recalibrated. Hidden factions that had been dormant for years began resurfacing, interpreting his movement as either vulnerability or opportunity. Both interpretations were dangerous. But Damian did not stop. He moved through secure corridors toward transport access, his mind locked not on fear, but on contradiction. He refused to label what he was doing as emotional. He rejected the idea that responsibility could be mistaken for sentiment. And yet, every decision he made now bypassed the cold logic that had defined him for years. That contradiction was the only thing he did not control. As transport preparations activated, intelligence updates reached him in rapid succession. The observers around the child's location had stopped probing. They had stabilized, which meant they were preparing. The pattern was now unmistakable. This was not surveillance anymore. It was pre-attack positioning. Damian Cross did not hesitate. For the first time, he personally authorized full override deployment toward the child's location. And the moment that order went live, every hidden faction watching his empire understood the same thing at once. The most feared man alive was no longer observing from distance. He was entering the equation. But even as his convoy prepared to move, another transmission arrived from the child's location, unverified, urgent, and already too late to ignore, because an assassination attempt had just begun targeting the child's safe perimeter on the exact night Damian Cross decided to go there himself. When enemies touched the child, the Empire stopped being business. The first breach did not announce itself with noise. It arrived with precision. The perimeter around Ethan Cross's location, once quiet under controlled surveillance, fractured in a sequence so coordinated it erased any illusion of randomness. Security feeds flickered. External communication narrowed. Response teams began moving too late, reacting to an attack already designed around their timing. This was not pressure testing. This was execution planning turning active. Inside the residential structure, panic had not yet fully formed, but instability had. Protective personnel attempted containment. But the attackers were not improvising. They moved with disciplined intent, cutting visibility lines and isolating access points with surgical efficiency. And then the balance of control changed, because Damian Cross arrived, not through official channels, not through scheduled deployment. He entered the operational zone like a correction to a system that had failed its primary function. His presence did not announce itself. It rewrote the battlefield logic instantly. The attackers registered it first, not visually, systemically. Their coordination patterns shifted mid-operation, recognizing something in the environment had changed from resistance to consequence. Damian did not issue warnings. He removed movement. What followed was not chaos. It was controlled elimination. Each step he took adjusted the outcome of the environment around him. Attackers who had entered with structured confidence began losing spatial certainty. Communication collapsed. Formation integrity dissolved. He did not act like a ruler managing territory. He acted like a force removing interruption. For the first time, violence around Damian Cross was not strategic. It was personal. Every neutralization was immediate, efficient, and absolute, not to send a message, but to end interruption between him and what had been targeted. Inside the structure, a secondary door opened. A woman emerged. The mother. Her condition reflected prolonged concealment under stress exposure, shock layered over exhaustion, fear held together by instinct alone. Her eyes locked onto Damian immediately, not with recognition of his power, but with disbelief that he had arrived at all. She did not speak. There was no time for it. Damian moved past her without hesitation. his focus narrowing toward the inner room where the child was held. And then he saw him, Ethan Cross. Small, vulnerable, real. The moment suspended all operational processing inside Damien's mind. Not because the situation changed, but because nothing in his training accounted for what happened next. There was no calculation, no tactical adjustment, only recognition without structure. For a man who had built existence on eliminating emotional interference, the presence of the child created a momentary system failure. Not in weakness, but in reclassification. Every survival protocol he had ever used suddenly reorganized itself around a single point of focus. Not empire, not threat, presence. Behind him, the remaining attackers were being systematically removed by his arriving units, but Damien no longer registered them in the same way. For the first time, he was not evaluating outcomes. He was holding a boundary between what existed and what could be taken. His identity did not break. It shifted, subtle, irreversible. Then, as the last pockets of resistance collapsed, one surviving attacker was dragged forward by security forces, injured, disoriented, barely conscious, but still alive long enough to speak. Damien turned slowly. The room fell into controlled silence. The attacker coughed once, then laughed weakly, as if even survival had irony attached to it. And then he spoke a name, not of an enemy outside, but of someone inside Damien Cross's own organization. The revelation landed not like information, but like structural collapse beginning from within. The enemy wasn't outside. It was already sitting at his table. The name spoken by the surviving attacker did not echo in the room. It did not need to. In Damien Cross's world, certain names did not require volume to cause impact. They simply redefined every assumption built around them. For a brief moment, silence took over the operational space. Not confusion, not hesitation, something colder. Recalculation of trust architecture. Damien did not respond immediately. His expression remained controlled, but the environment around began to shift in response to his stillness. Security personnel instinctively tightened formation. Communications were minimized. Even movement slowed, as if the system itself understood that something foundational had been compromised. A powerful internal realization formed with clarity that carried no emotional softness. This was not an external attack. It was internal authorization. The betrayal had not entered his empire through force. It had been granted access through familiarity. The investigation that followed did not require speculation. It required confirmation. Within minutes, encrypted traces began surfacing across restricted internal channels. Financial rerouting patterns, silent authorization overrides, and operational blind spots that had been created not in chaos, but in structured decision-making over time. Someone inside his closest circle had not simply participated in the assassination attempt. They had enabled it. A trusted ally. A name once present at every critical decision point. A man who had sat within Damien's strategic inner circle, as if loyalty had already been proven beyond question. Now exposed as a structural origin point of coordinated manipulation. The realization did not trigger outward reaction. Instead, it compressed Damien's focus into something far more dangerous than anger. Clarity, without emotional dilution. He saw the empire differently now. Every delayed report, every misdirected operation, every subtle inconsistency that had once been dismissed as external pressure now reassembled itself into a pattern of internal design. It had never been random. It had been prepared. Across the network, systems began to fracture under sudden corrective intervention. Damien initiated immediate purge protocols, not impulsively, but with surgical precision. Communication layers were isolated. Authority hierarchies were frozen for verification. Entire operational branches were placed under silent lockdown. Those closest to him began to understand what was happening, not through announcements, through absence of trust. The emotional transformation inside Damien Cross did not resemble collapse. It resembled compression into something denser. The more he confirmed betrayal, the less emotional fragmentation remained. What replaced it was a singular directional force. Protection anchored to one point. The child. Ethan Cross was no longer just a discovered truth. He had become the only fixed variable in a system that had lost structural reliability. Everything else, loyalty, empire, history, had become conditional. Damien's internal recalibration completed within hours. The hierarchy of his empire was rewritten without announcement. Old structures were removed from decision pathways. Entire command chains were replaced with isolated, redundant systems designed to prevent single-point corruption. Power was no longer centralized through trust. It was enforced through verification loops. What had once been an empire built on controlled fear was now being reconstructed into something far more unstable and far more precise, a system designed to protect what could not be replaced. But even as restructuring finalized, Damien understood something deeper had changed permanently. The betrayal was no longer an event. It was a condition of existence. And conditions could not simply be removed. They had to be contained, monitored, and eventually eliminated at the root. Then a second intelligence stream arrived, not from external surveillance, not from intercepted enemy communication, but from within the recalibrated system itself. A fragmented operational trace, previously hidden beneath layered authorization codes, resurfaced with priority override status. Damien cross-read it once, then stopped, because this was not another betrayal confirmation. This was a second plan already in motion, and it was not aimed at his empire alone. It was aimed at both him and the child. He stopped being a ruler and became something far more dangerous. Damien Cross did not announce a shift in his identity. He did not articulate it, and he did not allow it to be interpreted as emotion. Instead, he acted on it with the same precision he had once reserved for empire-level operations. The child was relocated immediately, not to a safer location in theory, but to the highest protection zone his entire network could construct in real time, a layered environment built beneath controlled territory, designed not just to resist attack, but to absorb and neutralize it before contact could occur. Every parameter was redefined around one absolute condition. Survival of Ethan Cross was no longer a variable in Damien's system. It was the system's purpose. The mother was integrated into the same protection structure under strict containment protocols, not as a hostage, not as leverage, but as a necessary continuity link. Her presence stabilized the child's environment, and in Damien's recalculated world, stability was no longer optional. It was operational priority. Inside the secure zone, something subtle began to occur. Damien did not engage the child in the way the outside world would define interaction. There were no emotional declarations, no visible sentimentality, but proximity created something quieter, more irreversible. Presence. The child responded not to authority, but to consistency. And Damien, for the first time in his existence, allowed his actions to be governed by something that could not be optimized or negotiated. Protection without strategic benefit. Elsewhere, the empire began to shift shape. What had once been an organization built on dominance and control over external systems was now transforming into something entirely different. Communication channels were restructured into parallel redundancy networks. Operational cells were isolated into autonomous units. Loyalty was no longer assumed. It was continuously verified. The empire was no longer a hierarchy. It was becoming a defensive organism. Enemies who had previously operated in fragmented coordination began to notice the change. Their intelligence networks reported unusual consolidation patterns, accelerated countermeasures, and an absence of hesitation in Damien's responses that had not existed before. The window of advantage was closing, but what they did not yet fully understand was the shift beneath it. Damien Cross was no longer responding to threats in defense of power. He was responding in defense of something that could not be rebuilt if lost. The emotional transformation inside him was not visible in expression or tone. It was structural. Every decision now passed through a single filter. Does this increase the probability of the child surviving the next unknown variable? If not, it was removed. The mother of the child began to notice it first. Not fear, not control, but consistency. A man who had once felt like an unpredictable force of dominance was now becoming something far more unsettling. Predictable in protection, relentless in preservation, absolute in prioritization. And in that consistency, something fragile began forming within the silence between them. Trust without explanation. Meanwhile, the Empire finalized its transformation. What remained of Damien Cross's old structure had been dismantled internally and rebuilt into a multi-layered war framework. Offensive capabilities were preserved, but only as secondary function. Every system now served one central directive: preempt, intercept, and eliminate any threat capable of reaching the child. And Damien himself, no longer positioned as ruler at the top of an empire, stood at the center of a weaponized system built entirely around protection. The most feared man alive had not become softer. He had become focused in a way that erased everything except what mattered. And that focus changed everything about what the world thought it knew about him. Because empires built on fear collapse when fear is removed. But systems built around protection do not collapse. They detonate. And that detonation began the moment multiple independent alerts triggered across Damien Cross's network simultaneously. A large-scale coordinated attack had begun on multiple Empire locations at once. Power meant nothing anymore, only survival of what was his. The coordinated attack did not unfold as a surprise to Damien Cross. It unfolded as confirmation. Every system he had rebuilt was already in motion before the first strike fully registered across his network. What followed was not panic, not chaos, but synchronized response, an empire functioning as a single organism designed for one purpose: neutralization of all threats, internal and external. Damien did not command from distance anymore. He directed from within the structure itself. Countermeasures activated across multiple continents simultaneously. Hidden enforcement cells emerged from long-dormant positions. Financial choke points were sealed off in seconds. Communication channels used by the Betrayal Network were hijacked and reversed, turning coordination lines into exposure pathways. What had once been an empire of influence was now a system of elimination. And at the center of it, Damien Cross remained completely focused, not scattered, not reactive, aligned. The Betrayal Network that had operated in silence for months began collapsing under its own exposed structure. Names surfaced. Transactions unraveled. Internal allies who had once believed themselves invisible were identified in real time and removed from operational relevance without hesitation. There was no spectacle to it, only completion. In a secured environment far from the battlefield, the child remained protected under layered containment protocols. The mother stayed within the same structure, now fully aware that survival was no longer uncertain. It was enforced. The war outside no longer defined their safety. Damien did, and for the first time, that reality did not feel like control. It felt like responsibility made physical. As the final phase of the counteroffensive unfolded, Damien's attention never fractured. Reports came in, systems stabilized, resistance points dissolved one by one. Every threat that once defined his empire's instability was now being removed with irreversible precision. But something had fundamentally changed in how he processed victory. There was no satisfaction in dominance, only continuation of protection. The transformation that had begun the moment he learned of the child's existence had now completed its final stage. Damien Cross was no longer operating as a ruler managing an empire. He was operating as a guardian managing survival conditions for something irreplaceable. Fear, once a foundation of his influence, had become secondary. Focus had replaced it entirely. Those closest to him understood it without being told. His decisions were no longer shaped by expansion or reputation. They were shaped by distance from threat. Every action moved outward from one central point that could not be compromised: the child. And in that restructuring, his legacy changed permanently. He was no longer the most feared man alive because of what he could destroy. He was feared because of what he was now willing to protect. As the final nodes of the Betrayal Network collapsed and silence returned across his operational grid, Damien Cross stood in the aftermath of a war that no longer felt like conquest. It felt like preservation. But beneath that silence, far beyond the reach of his immediate systems, something remained unnoticed. Deep inside the world he controlled, beyond verified channels and monitored intelligence layers, an unseen observer had begun compiling data. Not on Damien Cross, not on his empire, but on the child, watching, learning, preparing, not for today, not for survival, But for a future revenge no one in Damien Cross's world had yet learned how to anticipate.